The CIA's early psychological warfare operations in Western Europe between 1947 and 1952 emerged from a strategic environment defined by exhaustion, uncertainty, and political fragility, in which the devastation of World War II had left societies economically strained, institutions weakened, and populations susceptible to influence at a moment when the contours of the Cold War were still being formed. And within this environment, American policymakers concluded that military power alone was insufficient to secure Western Europe against perceived communist expansion, because the primary contest was not territorial, but political, unfolding through elections, labor movements, and public opinion rather than armed confrontation. And it was this assessment that drove the creation of a covert psychological warfare apparatus designed to shape attitudes, constrain the influence of communist parties, and stabilize pro-Western governments without resorting to overt force. And the foundation of these efforts lay in the reorganization of U.S. intelligence and foreign policy machinery after 1947, when the National Security Act created the Central Intelligence Agency and provided it with a mandate that included covert action, a mandate deliberately framed with ambiguity to allow deniable intervention in the political life of Allied states. And from its inception, this mandate was interpreted expansively by American officials, who believed that the ideological struggle with communism required active measures to influence foreign societies, particularly in Western Europe, where strong communist parties, militant labor unions, and fragile coalitions threatened to undermine recovery and alignment with the United States. And the urgency of this mission was reinforced by developments such as the collapse of coalition governments in France and Italy, the strength of communist-led unions in key industries, and the perception that economic hardship could translate into political realignment if left unaddressed. And within this context, psychological warfare was conceived not as propaganda in the traditional sense, but as a comprehensive effort to shape the informational environment in which political decisions were made, integrating media influence, labor engagement, and narrative framing into a coordinated strategy that operated largely behind the scenes. And the early architecture of these operations reflected lessons drawn from wartime experience, particularly the recognition that influence was most effective when it appeared organic rather than imposed, leading the CIA to prioritize indirect methods that worked through local actors, institutions, and voices, rather than overt American messaging. And this approach was evident in the emphasis on supporting non-communist media outlets, funding cultural and political organizations, and strengthening labor unions that opposed communist leadership, all while maintaining plausible deniability to avoid nationalist backlash or diplomatic fallout. And operationally, the CIA established specialized units responsible for psychological warfare and political action, working closely with the State Department and, where appropriate, with Allied intelligence services, to ensure that covert influence complemented overt diplomatic and economic initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, which provided the material foundation for recovery, while psychological operations sought to shape interpretation and political outcomes. And this integration was central to the strategy, because economic aid alone could not guarantee political stability if narratives framing that aid were controlled by hostile actors, and thus information control became a parallel front in the effort to anchor Western Europe within the emerging U.S.-led order. And in practice, these operations took multiple forms, beginning with media influence campaigns that aimed to strengthen independent newspapers, radio stations, and publishing houses, aligned with democratic and anti-communist values, often through covert subsidies, placement of sympathetic editors, or the provision of content that emphasized reconstruction, prosperity, and Western solidarity. And these efforts were calibrated to local contexts, recognizing that overtly American messaging could provoke resistance, whereas support for indigenous voices allowed narratives to circulate with greater credibility. And alongside media operations, the CIA focused intensively on labor unions, which were seen as critical battlegrounds because of their capacity to mobilize workers, disrupt economies, and influence electoral politics. And in countries such as France and Italy, communist-led unions exerted significant influence over key sectors, raising fears in Washington that strikes and labor unrest could destabilize governments and undermine recovery. And to counter this influence, the CIA covertly supported non-communist labor organizations, providing funding, training, and organizational assistance designed to strengthen alternative leadership and to frame labor advocacy in terms compatible with democratic capitalism rather than revolutionary politics. And this support was often channeled through intermediaries to preserve deniability, reinforcing the principle that psychological warfare depended on invisibility as much as effectiveness. And beyond media and labor, early CIA psychological operations extended into cultural and intellectual spheres, where influence over writers, academics, and opinion leaders was seen as essential to shaping long-term attitudes toward democracy, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And while these efforts were less centralized and more experimental during the 1947 to 1952 period, they reflected a growing conviction that the Cold War would be decided not only by policy outcomes, but by the moral and intellectual frameworks through which societies understood their choices. And this conviction drove investment in conferences, publications, and exchanges that promoted liberal democratic norms and marginalized communist ideology without appearing to suppress it directly. And underlying all of these activities was a common operational logic that prioritized shaping choice rather than imposing outcomes, seeking to influence what options appeared legitimate, viable, or inevitable within Western European societies. And this logic required careful coordination to avoid exposure, because discovery of covert American involvement risked delegitimizing the very actors and institutions the operation sought to strengthen. And as a result, compartmentation, cutouts, and financial complexity became defining features of early CIA psychological warfare, allowing funds and guidance to flow without clear attribution, and the effectiveness of these operations varied by country and context. But during this early period, they were generally assessed within U.S. intelligence circles as essential to preventing political drift during a moment of exceptional vulnerability, reinforcing the belief that covert influence could serve as a substitute for overt intervention. And yet, even as these operations expanded, they operated within a broader framework of escalation control. Because American policymakers were acutely aware that aggressive manipulation of allied societies carried risks, including backlash, exposure, and the erosion of democratic legitimacy, and thus early psychological warfare in Western Europe was characterized by a tension between urgency and restraint, as intelligence officers sought to act decisively while remaining invisible, shaping outcomes without appearing to do so. And this tension defined the formative years of CIA covert action doctrine, setting precedents for how influence would be exercised in the Cold War's political battlegrounds. And by 1952, the basic contours of this approach were established, with media influence, labor engagement, and information control, integrated into a sustained effort to stabilize Western Europe within the American sphere. Not through coercion, but through the careful management of perception, organization, and narrative at a moment when the future of the continent remained uncertain, and the Cold War was still being fought primarily in the realm of politics rather than arms. As these early psychological warfare operations expanded between 1948 and 1950, they became increasingly systematized, reflecting the CIA's growing confidence that political outcomes in Western Europe could be influenced through sustained information control rather than episodic intervention. And this confidence was reinforced by early successes in blunting communist electoral momentum and labor militancy, outcomes that were interpreted within Washington as validation of covert influence, despite the difficulty of isolating causation in complex political environments. And during this period, operational planning emphasized permanence, as short-term campaigns were replaced by longer duration programs designed to embed anti-communist narratives within the institutional fabric of Western European societies, ensuring that influence would persist beyond immediate crises. And this emphasis on durability was particularly evident in media operations, where the CIA moved from emergency support for struggling publications toward the cultivation of stable networks of editors, publishers, and journalists whose professional survival became indirectly linked to continued alignment with democratic and Atlanticist perspectives, and funding mechanisms were deliberately structured to avoid obvious dependency, often passing through foundations, advertising arrangements, or third-party intermediaries that obscured origin while reinforcing sustainability. And this structural embedding allowed influence to persist even as overt U.S. attention shifted elsewhere, creating a self-reinforcing informational environment in which certain viewpoints enjoyed disproportionate visibility, and parallel developments occurred within the labor sphere, where early CIA engagement evolved from reactive countermeasures against strikes into proactive organizational development, supporting the emergence of non-communist union leadership, capable of mobilizing workers without aligning with revolutionary agendas. And this support often took the form of training programs, logistical assistance, and strategic advice, rather than direct instruction, reflecting an understanding that effective influence required local ownership rather than external direction. And by strengthening alternative labor institutions, the CIA sought not merely to weaken communist unions, but to redefine the boundaries of legitimate labor activism, framing collective bargaining and worker representation as compatible with democratic capitalism rather than antagonistic to it. And this reframing was reinforced through coordinated media messaging that portrayed non-communist unions as responsible and modern, while depicting communist-led actions as disruptive and aligned with foreign interests, a narrative that gained traction as economic recovery accelerated and the costs of instability became more apparent to workers themselves. And alongside media and labor efforts, the CIA expanded its engagement with political parties and civic organizations, offering covert support to centrist and social democratic groups viewed as bulwarks against polarization, particularly in electoral contexts where narrow margins could determine government composition. And this support was carefully calibrated to avoid overt dominance, as American planners recognized that excessive intervention could delegitimize allied governments and fuel nationalist backlash, and thus influence was exerted indirectly through messaging assistance, organizational support, and strategic coordination, rather than through direct control. And throughout this period, coordination with overt U.S. policy instruments remained central, because psychological warfare was designed to complement economic aid and diplomatic engagement rather than substitute for them, ensuring that narratives of recovery and cooperation were grounded in tangible improvement rather than abstract ideology. And this integration reduced the risk that covert influence would be exposed as hollow or manipulative, anchoring it instead in lived experience. And as operations matured, internal CIA assessments increasingly emphasized the importance of consistency and patience, recognizing that shaping public opinion and institutional culture required sustained effort over years rather than dramatic intervention. a recognition that distinguished early Western European psychological warfare from later, more abrupt covert actions in other regions. And yet this patience coexisted with constant concern about exposure, as the expansion of operations increased the number of actors and financial pathways involved, raising the risk that investigative journalism or political inquiry could uncover American involvement. And to mitigate this risk, the CIA refined compartmentation practices, limiting knowledge of full operational scope, even within allied institutions, and ensuring that individual participants perceived support as routine assistance rather than coordinated strategy. And this compartmentation preserved deniability while complicating internal oversight, embedding influence deeply enough that it could persist even if individual components were compromised. And by the early 1950s, these practices had created an operational environment in which American psychological warfare functioned as a background condition of Western European politics rather than a visible intervention, shaping discourse through cumulative effect rather than overt persuasion. And in doing so, they contributed to the stabilization of a political order aligned with the United States at a moment when alternative trajectories appeared plausible, reinforcing the belief within American intelligence circles that information control, when applied subtly and persistently, could be as decisive as military power in determining Cold War outcomes. As the early 1950s approached, the CIA's psychological warfare operations in Western Europe entered a phase of consolidation and reassessment, driven by the recognition that influence campaigns carried inherent risks alongside their perceived benefits, and that long-term stability required not only countering communist influence, but managing the political legitimacy of the methods used to do so. And within this reassessment, American planners confronted the paradox that covert support for democratic institutions risked undermining those same institutions if exposure revealed foreign manipulation, a paradox that forced continual calibration between effectiveness and restraint. And this calibration shaped how operations were refined rather than abandoned, because by this point, psychological warfare had become embedded in U.S. strategy as an indispensable instrument of Cold War competition. And in media operations, this refinement took the form of reducing overt editorial guidance while increasing structural support, allowing publications to maintain editorial independence in appearance and practice while benefiting from financial stability and access that indirectly reinforced alignment with anti-communist perspectives. And this shift acknowledged that credibility with domestic audiences depended on authenticity, not uniform messaging, and thus influence was exercised through enabling conditions rather than direct control. And in the labor domain, a similar evolution occurred, as CIA-supported unions were encouraged to develop their own policy platforms and leadership cultures, reducing reliance on external guidance while maintaining informal alignment through shared interests and institutional ties. And this maturation process reflected a strategic understanding that durable influence required indigenous agency, because movements perceived as externally driven were vulnerable to delegitimation and collapse. And as these indigenous structures strengthened, the CIA increasingly positioned itself as a facilitator rather than a director, monitoring outcomes and intervening selectively when balance appeared threatened. And this facilitator role required sophisticated situational awareness, as analysts tracked electoral trends, strike activity, and media narratives to assess whether intervention was necessary or whether existing dynamics favored desired outcomes. And this reliance on analysis underscored the intelligence dimension of psychological warfare because influence operations depended on accurate understanding of social and political currents rather than mechanical application of messaging. And failures of understanding could produce counterproductive results, reinforcing opposition or fueling suspicion, and as part of this learning process, internal debates emerged within the CIA and the broader U.S. government regarding the ethical and strategic limits of covert influence in Allied societies. Debates that did not halt operations but influenced their scope and presentation, encouraging a preference for indirect engagement over direct manipulation. And these debates were shaped by the broader political environment in the United States, where congressional oversight and public opinion placed implicit constraints on how far covert action could go without risking domestic backlash if revealed. And thus psychological warfare in Western Europe was conducted within a layered accountability structure that, while opaque, imposed real limits on escalation. And by 1951 and 1952, the cumulative effect of these operations was evident in the relative stabilization of Western European political systems, as communist parties faced declining electoral fortunes and labor unrest became more manageable within institutional frameworks, developments that American officials interpreted as confirmation that the combination of economic recovery and information control had succeeded in anchoring the region within the Western camp. And this interpretation reinforced confidence in the model, encouraging its adaptation to other regions even as conditions differed significantly. And yet, the Western European experience also left a legacy of caution, because the complexity of these operations and their dependence on local context underscored that psychological warfare could not be standardized without loss of effectiveness, and this realization influenced how subsequent covert actions were planned, emphasizing flexibility and contextual sensitivity. And in the final years of the 1947 to 1952 period, the CIA's early psychological warfare efforts thus transitioned from experimental interventions into a more mature system of influence, characterized by structural embedding, analytical oversight, and restrained execution. And this transition marked a defining moment in the institutionalization of covert action as a central component of U.S. Cold War strategy, setting patterns that would endure long after the immediate vulnerabilities of post-war Europe had receded. As these early operations reached their mature form by 1952, their significance increasingly lay in how they reshaped American conceptions of power, rather than in any single political outcome, because the CIA's psychological warfare in Western Europe demonstrated that influence could be exercised most effectively through sustained environmental shaping, rather than episodic intervention, a lesson that altered how U.S. policymakers understood the relationship between intelligence, diplomacy, and domestic politics in Allied states. And this understanding reinforced the belief that Cold War competition would be decided less by dramatic confrontation than by the gradual alignment of institutions, narratives, and expectations. And within the CIA, this belief translated into organizational permanence, as units dedicated to psychological warfare and political action became institutionalized rather than treated as temporary responses to crisis, embedding covert influence into routine strategic planning. And this institutionalization was reflected in the development of standardized practices for funding, liaison, and analysis that could be adapted to local contexts while preserving core principles of deniability and indirect control. And as these practices solidified, the Western European experience was increasingly cited internally as evidence that subtle intervention could yield durable results without provoking overt backlash, reinforcing confidence in covert action as a viable instrument of policy. And yet this confidence coexisted with a growing awareness of fragility, because the success of these operations depended on conditions that were historically specific, including post-war dislocation, economic vulnerability, and the absence of entrenched democratic legitimacy, conditions that made societies more receptive to external support and narrative framing. And as Western Europe stabilized economically and politically, the relative leverage of psychological warfare diminished, prompting a shift toward maintenance rather than transformation, as CIA efforts focused on preserving gains rather than engineering new outcomes. And this shift highlighted a key insight of the period, that influence operations are most potent during moments of transition and uncertainty, and that their effectiveness declines as institutions consolidate and publics become less malleable. And this insight informed later Cold War planning by emphasizing early intervention over reactive measures. And analytically, the Western European campaigns underscored the importance of integration across domains, because psychological warfare proved most effective when synchronized with economic aid, diplomatic, reassurance, and security guarantees, illustrating that information control could not substitute for material improvement, but could amplify its political effects. And this integration reduced the risk that covert influence would be exposed as manipulative, grounding narratives in lived experience rather than abstract messaging. And from a historical perspective, these operations also illuminate the blurred boundary between support and manipulation in Cold War policy, revealing how the United States justified intervention in Allied societies as a defensive necessity while accepting the tension this created with democratic norms. A tension managed through secrecy and deniability rather than resolved through transparency. And this tension would persist throughout the Cold War, shaping debates over the legitimacy and limits of covert action. And by the conclusion of the 1947 to 1952 period, the CIA's early psychological warfare in Western Europe had achieved its immediate objective of stabilizing the region within the Western camp. But its deeper legacy lay in the doctrines it established, doctrines that treated media, labor, and information control as enduring arenas of competition requiring continuous attention. And these doctrines influenced U.S. behavior far beyond Europe, even as the specific conditions that had made early success possible faded. And in this sense, the Western European campaigns represent a formative chapter in Cold War history, illustrating how power could be exercised quietly through institutions and narratives, shaping political landscapes over time without the visible use of force, and setting precedents that would define the conduct of covert influence operations for decades. In the longer-term evaluation of these early CIA psychological warfare operations, their most consequential effect was the normalization of covert influence as a routine instrument of policy in Allied democratic societies, a development that reshaped both the practice of intelligence and the assumptions underpinning Western Cold War strategy. Because once influence over media, labor unions, and political discourse proved feasible without immediate backlash, it became easier to justify continued intervention as a preventative necessity rather than an exceptional measure. And this normalization altered institutional culture within the CIA, encouraging planners to view information control as an enduring requirement rather than a temporary response to post-war instability. And this perspective was reinforced by comparative assessments that contrasted Western Europe's stabilization with perceived vulnerabilities elsewhere, leading to the conclusion that early, subtle intervention could forestall more costly confrontations later, a logic that would recur throughout the Cold War with varying degrees of success. And within Western Europe itself, the legacy of these operations was complex, because while they contributed to political stability and economic recovery, they also embedded patterns of external dependence and elite alignment that influenced post-war governance, reinforcing Atlanticist orientations while narrowing the space for alternative political expression. And this narrowing was not absolute, but it shaped the parameters of debate, privileging certain economic and security assumptions as common sense, while marginalizing others as irresponsible or extreme. And from an operational standpoint, This outcome represented success because the objective was not ideological uniformity, but the prevention of outcomes perceived as strategically dangerous. And yet this success also carried long-term implications because it reinforced a model of democracy in which external influence operated invisibly beneath formal processes, a model that complicated later debates about sovereignty, transparency, and legitimacy. And these complications remained largely latent during the early Cold War, overshadowed by the urgency of containment, but they would resurface in later decades as exposure of covert actions prompted reassessment of past practices. And analytically, the 1947 to 1952 campaigns demonstrated the difficulty of disentangling cause and effect in influence operations, because political outcomes emerged from the interaction of economic recovery, institutional reform, and information control rather than from any single intervention, making it tempting to overestimate the role of covert action in shaping history. And this temptation influenced internal narratives within the CIA, where successes were often attributed to skill and planning, rather than to favorable context, reinforcing confidence in methods that were less effective when conditions differed. And this pattern underscores the importance of viewing early Western European psychological warfare as a product of its time, effective in a moment of dislocation, but not easily generalizable. And as Cold War competition expanded globally, the lessons drawn from Europe were applied unevenly, sometimes with destabilizing consequences. And in retrospect, the Western European experience stands out as an instance where covert influence aligned with broader structural trends toward recovery and integration, amplifying outcomes that might have occurred in any case. And by the early 1950s, the immediate urgency that had driven psychological warfare began to recede as institutions strengthened and the geopolitical landscape solidified, shifting the focus from transformation to maintenance. And in this maintenance phase, the CIA's role became less visible but no less significant, as influence operations continued quietly to reinforce established alignments, monitor emerging threats, and intervene selectively when necessary. And this quiet persistence reflects the enduring legacy of the early period, because it established a template for how the United States would seek to manage political risk in allied societies through indirect means, balancing support and manipulation in a way that minimized overt confrontation while shaping outcomes over time. And in the broader Cold War narrative, these operations illustrate how the struggle for influence was waged not only through alliances and deterrence, but through the subtle regulation of information, organization, and perception, a regulation that left lasting imprints on Western Europe's post-war political landscape and on the conduct of intelligence as an instrument of statecraft. In concluding the examination of the CIA's early psychological warfare operations in Western Europe between 1947 and 1952, their lasting significance lies in how they redefined the boundaries of acceptable state action in the Cold War, embedding covert influence within the normal functioning of peacetime politics at a moment when the future of the continent remained uncertain. Because these operations demonstrated that media ecosystems, labor organizations, and informational environments could be shaped quietly and persistently without overt coercion, and that such shaping could stabilize political systems in ways that military force could not achieve without unacceptable risk. And this realization altered American strategic thinking by elevating psychological warfare from an auxiliary tool to a central pillar of containment, one that operated continuously beneath the surface of diplomacy and economic aid, reinforcing alignment through perception and institutional support rather than compulsion. And within the CIA, this period marked the transition from improvisation to doctrine, as early experiments in influence hardened into structured practices governed by principles of deniability, indirect engagement, and long-term patience, principles that would guide covert action for decades. And for Western Europe, the impact of these operations was cumulative rather than dramatic, shaping political outcomes through the narrowing of viable alternatives and the strengthening of centrist institutions rather than through overt suppression of dissent. And this subtlety explains both their effectiveness and their ambiguity, because while they contributed to stability and recovery, they also blurred distinctions between domestic agency and external influence, complicating later understandings of sovereignty and democratic legitimacy. And from a historical perspective, the early psychological warfare campaigns illustrate how the Cold War was fought most decisively, not in moments of crisis, but in the management of everyday political life, where narratives about prosperity, responsibility, and alignment were reinforced through institutional support that appeared organic, even when it was not. And this management relied on a convergence of favorable conditions, including post-war dislocation, economic dependency, and the absence of entrenched political consensus. Conditions that made influence possible and whose erosion later reduced its effectiveness. And as these conditions faded, the early successes of Western Europe became increasingly difficult to replicate elsewhere, revealing the limits of generalizing from a unique historical moment. And yet the doctrines forged during this period endured, shaping how the United States approached political risk in Allied societies long after the immediate vulnerabilities of post-war Europe had passed. And in this sense, the 1947 to 1952 operations represent a formative chapter in Cold War history, one that illuminates how power was exercised quietly through media, labor, and information control, and how the struggle for influence was waged not only through overt policy, but through the careful regulation of perception, organization, and expectation, leaving a legacy that persisted long after the Cold War's early years gave way to a more rigid and polarized world.